system that we have today, the hoist shaft you guys came down in, part of that shaft is where the good clean air gets pumped down. When it hits this point, 650 feet, it goes through a big tube, and then on the other side of that tube is a system of fans that push the air out to where it needs to be. That's how we're breathing. But once it goes past those fans, you still have to keep guiding the air in the direction that you want it to go. So that's what they did here on the left. They built something called a gobble, G-O-B, gobble, because they gobbled together. They took empty dynamite boxes, filled them up with salt, and then stacked them on top of each other to seal off this opening so the air can't get through there. And that was basically what they did, and that's what they still do today. They would seal up openings where they don't want air to be going through. That way they can keep it going one direction. However, nowadays they don't use boxes, they use something else. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But first we'll go through here. In between these two towers, these are called cribbings. And on the ceiling you'll see some red salt. Now red salt has a lot of either iron or potassium in it, which makes it bitter to the taste. So for a long time, the miners would just mine around the red salt, because back then they were mining mostly for cattle feed. Red salt doesn't work for cattle feed because it has a bitter taste to it because of that iron and potassium. But now that we use salt for the roads, that's no longer an issue. You can put red salt or pure salt on the roads, it will work just as well.
Or in your eyes.
On the left, we have that same crystal pod that we were looking at just a little bit ago. Now in that pure salt, there's a red line running through it. That is red salt. Red salt and pure salt usually go hand in hand. If you find one of them somewhere, you're probably going to find the other somewhere close by. And this is a good example of that, since that red salt we just saw on the ceiling is just a pillar over. But not only is it a pillar over, it's actually big enough to where it's reaching over and it's touching this crystal pod. So that's why you see that red line. It's basically peeking through. Up here on the left, you'll see another gob wall. But there's also that picture in the back of all those rocks stacked up on top of each other. That was what they used to do for gob walls. They would use these big salt rocks to seal up these openings, but stacking up rocks is pretty difficult. You have to stack them just so they don't fall down, which makes it unstable. Also, air still seeps through all those holes and cracks, which defeats the purpose of putting a wall there. So they switched over to boxes, which worked a lot better. It was a lot more stable, but still very time consuming to set up. So then they switched again to what we call a Brattis curtain. Brattis curtains are what we use today to direct airflow. They used to be made of jute or wool, but today they're made with reinforced vinyl. And this last picture of this fan, the fan was again used to help with the airflow down here. Next to this picture is what's left of a fan from the 1950s. On your right, you'll see what we call a floor heave. Floor heaves happen because of all the weight that's above us. It's pushing down on this pillar, which pushes the pillar into the floor, which causes the floor to heave up. Just like when you play with clay or Play-Doh, when you press your thumb into it and it rises up around your thumb, that's basically what's happening here. And if you see the giant ruler stuck in there, it shows that this floor heave's come up about 3 feet so far. Still going up, just very, very slowly. But if you looked inside this floor heave, you would see that it's hollow underneath. That's because salt has weird elastic and plastic properties to it. It's going to bend before it breaks. And at the bottom of this floor heave is a more solid, more compact layer that's not going to get pushed around as easily. So if a can't go any further down, the floor will go back up. And then up here is another picture that shows when the opposite happens, when the roof comes down. It happens in two parts. The first part's what we call a roof sag, where a piece of the roof starts to sag down. That's what the man on the right is leaning up against. If it keeps on sagging, keeps on getting bigger, eventually it will fall from the ceiling, hit the floor, become a roof fall. That's what the man on the left is standing within. That's also what was out on the train ride. The big roof sags, like the one in this picture, those don't happen anymore. They've switched up their mining methods to where that doesn't happen. But roof sags do still occur, just in much, much smaller pieces. But even those are dangerous if they're occurring in the wrong spot. So if we find one, we use a thick metal bar. We call it a scaling bar. It looks a bit like a spear. We use that to pick away at it and bring it down.
Big pieces of salt. Can't see because I can't have a
Now
light.
today there are 3 companies that own spaces here in the salt mine. One of them is Stratica, the museum. And then there's Underground Vaults and Storage, or UVS for short. They're the ones that store the movie props, medical records, important documents, all that good stuff down here. And then there's the miners themselves, Hutchinson Salt Company, or Hutch Salt for short. They bought the rights to the
Mining
mine in
machine
the early 90s.
to your
and
right.
ever since.
In front of you where the camera's facing.
On the right, we have what's left of a 1932 Chevy pickup. Looks pretty rough, it's been down here for quite a while. Salt and metal don't play very well together. But also they had such a small shaft to bring down big equipment like this. So what they would do is they would take it apart, bring it down in pieces, and then weld it back together. Some pieces like the roof, the doors, the windshield, those weren't necessary, so they just left those pieces topside. They also replaced the engine with an electric motor, and that's to deal with the air concern, because if you have a normal diesel engine, that creates fumes, that contaminates all that good clean air. That's not good for anybody down here. So any machine that you see down here either used to run or currently runs on either electricity or a safer kind of diesel, biodiesel or soy diesel. We have these 2 devices. These were put here by the Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC, in the late 50s, early 60s. They came here to see if they could store some nuclear waste in this salt mine. One of the experiments was to figure out the closure rate of this mine, or how fast is it closing in on itself. That's what these devices are meant to measure. After 9 years of experiments, it was supposed to be 2 years, but 9 years later, they figured out that this mine is closing 1 inch every 500 years. Nowhere near as fast as they wanted it to be. So they left Hutchinson, they went over to Lyons, Kansas, the salt mine over there. They thought that was a better place to put things, so they started doing that. However, the public saw what they were doing, they were not happy. Because when you store nuclear waste in that mine, it's very close to the aquifer, and that's the drinking water. They didn't like that, so there was a backlash with some lawsuits that were filed or at least threatened. Eventually, the AEC just decided to cut their losses, pack up, and leave Kansas. But the salt deposit here in Hutchinson, the one that we're in right now, was discovered by accident back in 1887 by a man named Ben Blanchard. He was looking for oil, but when he drove down, he found salt instead. That was what sparked the big salt boom here in Kansas. That was in 1888. And then much later on, after the Cary Salt Company was formed, they built the mine shaft in 1922. It took about a year to build that shaft. And in 1923 was when the mining started. So as of last year, this mine is 100 years old. Now coming up on the right is our salt pile. This is the part where you guys need to get a piece of salt to take home with you. But before you do, just a few things. When these lights turn on, they're on a 5-minute timer before they shut back off. So we have 5 minutes to get our pieces. You can get one piece that's the size of your fist or smaller, no bigger. Or you can grab a bag from the table and fill it with smaller pieces. Just be sure you don't climb on the salt pile. It's very steep and slippery, and we don't want you to slip and fall. So you can go ahead and exit off to your right and go pick out a salt piece.
You can.
Oh, it's got red salt on the end. It has red salt on the end, guys. And right there.